Now, I'm delighted to say that every Wednesday from this moment on, around about this time, we will be talking to Neil Oliver, because I spoke to him last week and I thought, what a thoughtful individual, what a great guy to have as part of a regular thing on the Independent Republican, Mike Graham, because what we like to do here is to challenge opinions, to think about things in a different way, and to be very commonsensical about the world. Neil, welcome back. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, mate.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we spoke about this a little bit last week, but I wanted to explore it a little bit more this week, because we do seem to now have found ourselves in a place where everything is polarised, even from, whether you should smoke a cigarette or not, to whether you should vote for the breaking up of the United Kingdom, to whether you should, in fact, be wanting to stay in the European Union or leave it. It all seems to, it feels like it's very tribal.
Yes, I mean, in the introduction that you made about me there, and you wondered about how long we've been tribal and the history of tribal behaviour. It's older than our species, without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, we diverged from chimpanzees and gorillas 5, 6, 7 million years ago, and we all know through the work of Jane Goodall, primatologist in Tanzania, that chimps are tribal and gorillas are tribal, and we've in all periods through history of this country, this island has been populated by different tribes, and it's populated by them now. I think what's a challenge that has to be addressed is that the online, the internet, that remote virtual world has made it easier and even more tempting to remain in your tribe.
Yeah.
The period of lockdown demonstrates that our technology, we've made our machines so smart now that even when we're locked in our houses, we can still function. We can get all the food we need, we can get all the books we need, all the entertainment we need. We don't need to go outside and interact with people. And in those isolating circumstances, your attitudes can calcify and harden, and you're not being directly challenged by meeting people you don't agree with face to face. And the reality through all the history of tribes is that tribes need each other, even if they don't agree with one another, and even if they have opposing positions. It's the tension between tribes that keeps the ropes tight and keeps the big tent up. It's people pulling in different directions that give our society structure. But in the past, we had no alternative but to meet face to face with people and talk. And talk is fundamental to being successful human beings. And it's no use just talking to people that you agree with. And we've now made our machines so smart that the machinery out there is funneling information to us that it thinks we will agree with. So increasingly people are only hearing what they want to hear, in stark contrast to what they might need to know. And a lot of what you need to know you get from people you don't agree with, because they have different ideas. And it's the mixing of ideas that comes together and makes something successful. And so we're all being, because the machines are sending us, because the online world is sending us just what we want to hear, we're all beginning to behave like mini divas, mini celebrities. You're surrounded by online sycophants and toadies that only tell us what we want to hear. And that, a world populated by isolated divas who think that they are 100% right about everything, is no way to proceed as a successful society.
No, quite. And as I was saying about the word consensus, people seem to now think that consensus is a one-way street. People talk about, well, this has been done by consensus. For example, climate change has by far and away been decided by the consensus of scientists, a lot of scientists. But there are plenty of other scientists who don't go along with all of the so-called consensus. But if you're not on the side of consensus now, apparently you're some kind of devil incarnate, as indeed you found out after you appeared on the show last week. I was quite surprised. I suppose I should have known if I'd read up enough about the sort of spats you've had in the past, that the Scottish national contingent weren't too happy with you.
Well, I think because of the tribal aspect to politics and the identity politics, rather than when we encounter people really or virtually and treating them as individuals, there's a move to have us all treat one another as members of groups. That we're ascribing to the individual the attributes that we associate with a group, which is almost a textbook definition of racism as far as it goes.
Yeah.
But because we're not meeting with people and talking to them as individuals. When some people look at me and they hear my accent, and I'm obviously someone born in Scotland and raised in Scotland, I have a Scottish accent, and I'm associated for a lot of people with telling the history of Scotland. And some people made an assumption that I would have nationalist politics,
yeah,
and I don't.
But why would they do that, Neil? Do you think?
Well, because we're all hardening into groups, and people would ascribe to me what they associate with someone who's interested in Scottish history and someone who has a Scottish accent. And some people mistakenly made the assumption that because of those characteristics, also in the package would be that I would subscribe to Scottish Nationalist Party politics. And I just don't. But in terms of, I mean, I try to be, I'm by nature, amongst many other things, I'm pessimistic. I'm a fairly depressive, pessimistic character, but I know that I have to reach out to optimistic people because they are part of the antidote. They will teach me things that I need to know. And although, yes, as you point out, I've been on the receiving end of a bit of a torrent of negative material, I've also, through the same period, been reached out to by people who you might say are from other tribes. People who I know from finding out about them that they probably have lots of opinions, or at least some opinions that I wouldn't agree with. But nonetheless, they are reaching out to me and saying, I find common ground with you on certain things.
Right. And
that is the basis for a conversation. And I am more than happy to be disagreed with, challenged, because, you know, I'm not an expert on anything, but I'm constantly in the process of trying to find out more. I just want to know and understand as much as I can. And I get that. I get a huge amount of that from reaching out to and having conversations with people with whom I don't agree about certain things. The problem is that disagreement has become hatred.
Yeah.
It has become almost a necessity of the group, that if you subscribe to a group, you're supposed to hate, not just disagree with, but actually hate and loathe members of another group. And that's no basis for dialogue.
No.
You know, everything that we're ever going to know about the world is going to come from conversation. And at the moment, we've hardened into these groups, and it's partly the fault of the online virtual world where people aren't actually challenged to go and meet people face to face. But the conversations have dried up, and it's become these antagonistic situations where people are staying behind their barricades. We're growing further and further apart, and no man's land is growing between us, and it's no basis for mutual understanding.
No, I think that's right. And one of the things that troubled me about a lot of the hate that you were getting last week was that it wasn't based on really what you were saying. It was based on the fact that it was you that was saying whatever it was that you were saying. So they're not looking at what your ideas are or what your opinions are. They've just basically made you into this hate figure because you once said something that they didn't like. And that worries me because, as you say, there's smaller and smaller numbers of people who are able to say, look at you and go, well, I don't really like Neil Oliver. I don't really like his approach. I don't really like his TV show. I don't really like his attitude on Scottish independence. But actually, he's right about this. So very few people can now do that.
Yes, and that obviously plays into my the pessimistic side of my character. And I worry about that, because if that's the way we're going to go, then that is clearly not going to benefit anyone. You know, we're so polarized at the moment in ways that are so unhelpful, and there's a very strong narrative that's pervading everything, which is all about oppression. That everything in the world and the whole of human history has just been an exercise in the oppression of one group by another. You know, that women have been oppressed by men, that black people have been oppressed by white people, that poor people have been oppressed by rich people. And if that is a narrative, and it's taking away agency from people to see themselves as individuals. In terms of, you know, when you look at something like the development that we go through when we're children, you know, up until the age of about, I don't know, I'm not a child psychologist, but I think from reading about people like Jean Piaget and others that until the age of about 7, a child doesn't have any ability to make room for other people's opinions. They have an understanding of the world. They're not stupid. They just think differently than adults, but they don't make room for other people's opinions. And then from the age of about maybe, as you get older and from about 12 up, you start to make room for other people's opinions. So it's in the development of us as human beings from infancy through to adulthood that we're supposed to go through a point where, you start out dependent on your parents, and then you leave your parents behind, and you maybe find a tribe, a group, based on people that maybe dress like you or listen to the same music as you or have the same political opinions, and you find that group. But you can't stop at that point, because sometimes tribes go wrong. Sometimes groups go bad. And that's not to say that you then have to do away with the group and forget it ever happened. What it requires is mature thinking individuals. That's the word. That's the concept. Individuals within the group who are prepared to stand outside of their group and work to bring new life and new ideas back into it, to get it back onto the right track.
Yes.
And that's what keeps all groups going. And as long as I said earlier, I have been reached out to by people who I know I wouldn't agree. I might not agree with even 50% of their thinking, but they are reaching out, and they want to have conversations, and they want to have dialogue. So they step out of their group into no man's land. I step out of my group into no man's land. It's like the football game at Christmas time in the First World War. The people step into no man's land. They leave their groups behind briefly. They have a conversation, and they can go back in and they can put their tribe right, because they've learned new information from another tribe. And that new information lets you modify the tribe that you're a part of. If you're brave enough, you have to be brave enough to say, I'm not just going to trot out the party line. I'm not just going to say the tribal slogans. I'm going to go out on my own and say, I want to talk to other people. And so, although I've been pessimistic and I've been depressed, I've also been hugely encouraged by the fact that there are people from all sorts of groups that are quite alien to me, and have reached out to me and said, we need to talk about this. And you think, yes.
Yeah.
And if I learn crucial things from them and they learn crucial things from me and other people like me, we can go back into our groups and we can make our groups better. And fundamentally, all the tribes are necessary. We need each other. But the most exciting and helpful and interesting things in the world happen on the boundaries between the groups, where the groups actually bump up against each other. That's right.
That's why I find it fascinating that the political kind of spectrum has changed in some ways as well, and whether that has sort of fed into this situation that we have, because now it seems to be about identity politics more than ever, so that the Labour Party doesn't any longer stand for the working class sort of white men and women of this country. It doesn't get elected by the working class white men and women of this country any longer. Similarly, the Conservative Party does not really represent what it used to represent, which was a sort of, vaguely right-wing, rather laissez-faire, economically kind of very sure party. The things have all become mixed up. But it's almost like when I was living in America, people would say, if you're a Democrat, then you must be pro-abortion and you must be against the death penalty. And people would go, well, how can you be pro-abortion and be against and be for the death penalty? And some people were, and they'd go, well, we don't understand that. And so the same thing here. It seems like if you want to leave the European Union, you have another set of things that you also believe in, and you all join in that same tribal behaviour.
That is in the nature of tribes. I mean, we all belong to tribes. We do, whether we like it about ourselves or admit it about ourselves. We tend to group together with people we feel common ground with, and we take reassurance from being surrounded by people who seem, by and large, to kind of look like us and have a lot of the same attitudes as us. But that's not enough. No tribe, be it Conservative, be it Labour, if you want to talk about politics, there's no culture, there's no creed that doesn't need to be challenged from time to time by other people. But what's very pernicious at the moment is, for me, I mean, this is just my honest opinion that I'm prepared to have challenged, but I believe that in the West and manifest in what we've had in Britain for the last maybe couple of hundred years, and what's also absolutely written into the Constitution of the United States of America, is the belief in certain inalienable rights that are just the immutable rights and immutable thinking. And if you want to summarize it, it does come down to the sanctity of and respect for the individual. That's where the magic happens. If we remain stubbornly and quite frankly cowardly behind the barricades erected by our tribes, well, there comes a point where your tribe goes wrong, and your tribe needs to it's come off the rails, and it needs to move position. And that's why it's never, you can't just be, determinedly conservative for the whole of your life. And you can't just be determinedly Labour for the whole of your life, because from time to time, the party or the tribe or the clan goes wrong. And it takes individuals within the group to have the courage to stand outside of the group and say, this isn't good enough. We have to adopt some new thinking. There is no long-term benefit in just allowing all of your opinions to harden as though everything your tribe will ever say from now until the end of time will always be right and in the best interests of everyone. But that's why the individual is the most important thing. And at the moment we're trying, or there seems to be a deliberate attempt to frighten individuals into not having the courage. It's become harder and harder to stand up and come forward as an individual and say, just me, myself, I think there might be a better way of doing this, because you just get shouted down by the combined voices of the tribe. You get shouted down by your own tribe for stepping out of line, and you get shouted down and threatened with death and all sorts of hideousness by the opposing tribe.
Yes.
We've got to get back to a point where individuals feel the confidence to stand up and say, I don't think that my tribe is 100% right on this.
Right.
And
this is interesting. I mean, I've got a tweet here that says Neil Oliver's 100% correct. It's like we are being pushed into an American-style gang culture where they loathe an opposing gang and its area, where they have to fight and destroy them in order that they then take over. Because I grew up in a Britain, which was much less, shall we say, well upholstered than the one that we live in now. We didn't have an awful lot growing up in the 1970s. You know, we did have the occasional foreign holiday, but it wasn't anything like the ones my kids go on. And, but nobody seemed to be as bothered by what other people thought as we are now. You know, we allowed for a kind of fairly wide range of opinions on all sorts of things. Now, if you have a particular opinion, you are demonized.
This is something I don't understand, and I certainly don't profess to have a solution for it. But it seems incredibly ironic to me that at the moment in the West, in a place like Britain, in a place like North America, the potential for a good life has never been so good. More people have been lifted out of poverty since the 1980s. 80% of people have been lifted out of abject poverty since the 1980s. More people have more money. More children are being educated. We have more solutions for disease. The living has become much, much better, unrecognisably better, just during the course of my lifetime. And yet, as never before, we are at each other's throats about everything. And people are in danger, or some people are in danger of thinking that the peace and the prosperity that we have had is some kind of natural state, and that you can get angry with and burn down everything that we've had and still leave behind the prosperity and the good living. But that's not the natural state of humankind down through history. We know this. If you pay any kind of attention to history at all, and even the most superficial level, you know that in the past life was terrible. Life was unbearable for most people for most of the time. One of the great miracles is that our own personal ancestors survived the hideous long enough to make the people who made us. And yet now we're living in this time of relative prosperity, relative good health, relative opportunity here in the West, in Britain, in North America and other places. And yet we're at each other's throats as never before. And sometimes I wonder, we talked last week, Mike, about the pulling down of statues and wanting to undo or rewrite history. And I do wonder if partly it's because since the end of the Second World War, the people in the West have lived in increasingly peaceful and tolerant societies. So we're drifting further and further away from the reality of life and the world. The reality of life and the world is war, is suffering, abject suffering, pain, disease. All of that is in the natural order of things. But we've been cocooned for several generations now in a safe and tolerant and liberal world, comparatively speaking. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it's perfect. And most dangerous of all is that at this moment, of all moments, we're also contemplating forgetting history, doing away with aspects of history. As never before, we need to pay attention to history now, because for want of war or for some other terrible corrective, we need to look back and be reminded that the past was ugly and lives were nasty, brutish and short. Or we're going to lose that, or that will slip away from us. These things, this civilization that we have is the most fragile flower that has ever been given life. And it's beautiful, and we are all captivated by it. But if we don't look after it, it's gone like that.
Yeah. Absolutely right. What a fantastic series of things that you've said there. Neil, thank you so much again. Brilliant to have you on. We'll see you next week at the same time. I'm absolutely in agreement with you on this, because I've been saying for a while, basically, that the people of this country have got nothing to worry about. So they're now getting angry about things that they shouldn't be getting angry about. Neil has more or less said that in a much more eloquent way, I have to say. But what a fantastic a series of arguments he made. You can't tell me that isn't some of the greatest radio you've ever heard. This is Talk Radio.